I ask unanimous consent that the Senate, when it completes its business today, adjourns until 10 a.m. Thursday, June 18th. Further, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Walker nomination. Finally, notwithstanding Rule 22, post-cloture time on the Walker nomination expire at 1:30 p.m.
Without objection.
If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Blumenthal.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here to talk about the nomination of Justin Walker to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, but let's start with Connor Curran. Justin Walker actually has met Connor. Not really, but I introduced him to Connor through this picture during his nomination hearings in the Judiciary Committee. Several years ago, Connor was diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a degenerative, life-threatening disease which presently has no cure. Most people who have the disease die by their mid-20s. Connor was diagnosed at age 5. I met Connor a couple of years later. And there's probably nobody who has inspired me more with his courage, his energy, his strength of character than Connor Curran and his wonderful family who live in Ridgefield, Connecticut. His parents were told at the time of his diagnosis that this beautiful, young, sweet child would slowly lose his ability to run, lift his arms, hug them, and he would need complex care for the rest of his life. He would need multiple specialists that would cost tens of thousands of dollars each year, which they could not afford. But they made it possible. Or actually, it was made possible by the Affordable Care Act. And now, because of that act, he cannot be denied care. He's alive. He's not giving up. He's fighting for both a cure and the Affordable Care Act. And he's not the only one. There are 1.5 million people in the state of Connecticut alone, millions more around the country, living with pre-existing conditions. There are 182,000 children among those 1.5 million people, just like Connor, living with the potentially debilitating and even deadly effects of these pre-existing conditions, and there are millions more around the country. For them, for Americans, the Affordable Care Act is more than a law. It's a lifeline. Each of them can get the affordable care they need because of that lifeline. And right now, we all know healthcare has never been more important. We talk about it every day. We are full of rhetoric on the floor of this chamber about the healthcare crisis, which has precipitated an economic crisis, and about the disproportionate effects of that healthcare crisis, a pandemic of an insidious, deadly disease on poor and often communities of color. At the time of this crisis, the President of the United States has nominated Justin Walker to be an appellate judge, a present district court judge who has said that his main mission is to destroy the Affordable Care Act. Of course, that's perfectly consistent with the Trump administration's view of the Affordable Care Act. It is litigating in court right now against the Affordable Care Act. President Trump has opposed it consistently, constantly, vociferously. And Justin Walker, at his investiture as a district court judge, pledged that he would continue to make destruction of the Affordable Care Act a priority. He said during his investiture remarks, attended by his mentor, the majority leader, Senator McConnell, quote, "Although my legal principles are prevalent, they have not yet prevailed. Although we are winning, we have not won. Although we celebrate today, we cannot take for granted tomorrow, or we will lose our courts and our country." That wasn't some law review article that Justin Walker wrote back when he was going to school. It wasn't some speech that he made to a local chamber of commerce. It was literally at his swearing in as a United States District Court judge for the Western District of Kentucky. Just months ago, not even a year. My legal principles are prevalent. They have not yet prevailed. So, if there were new meaning to give to the word irony, this nomination would exemplify it. During a public health crisis, the President of the United States has nominated someone who wants to take health care away from people and deny them health insurance. Well, the reason Connor's here is really to show that these big principles have real-life consequences. Judges have impacts. The law matters. Words matter. Although my legal principles are prevalent, they have not yet prevailed. Although we are winning, we have not yet won. What does a Justin Walker win look like for those millions of Americans suffering from pre-existing conditions? It means denial of health care. And for Connor Curran and his family, it could be, in effect, a death sentence. That may sound like an exaggeration, but it isn't to those millions of Americans who have pre-existing conditions. It isn't to Connor and to his family. They live with the real-life consequences of laws that we make and decisions by the courts that may strike down those laws, like the Affordable Care Act. So the irony here is more than abstract. The outrage here should be real. Justin Walker, very simply, is unfit to be a judge on the Court of Appeals. He was judged unqualified to be a district court judge. And I asked my colleagues to reject his nomination. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
10 a.m. Say that again. Yeah. Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
The Senate gaveling out. Lawmakers passed a bipartisan public lands maintenance bill today. They also advanced the nomination of Justin Walker to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit Court. A number of senators also spoke about Senator Tim Scott's police reform legislation, which was introduced earlier. Follow Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.